Hello, and welcome to the History of Philosophy in China by Peter Adamson and Karen Lai, brought to you with the support of the Philosophy Department at King's College London and the LMU in Munich. Online at historyofphilosophy.net. Today's episode, Turning the Tables, Confucius in the Zhuangzi. Which historical figure from the Warring States period is most reminiscent of Hannibal Lecter, the serial killer from Silence of the Lambs? The answer can only be Robert Zi, a notorious criminal mentioned in the Zhuangzi. Or rather, the Zhuangzi doesn't just mention him, it devotes a whole chapter to him. In it, Robert Zi has an extended conversation with Kongzi, in which Robert Zi threatens to eat Kongzi's liver, although unlike Lecter, he does not mention pairing it with fava beans and a nice Chianti. As if that weren't bad enough, he chastises Kongzi for imposing on the people the ways of ancient sages. He even rudely addresses Kongzi by his personal name, Xu, whereas the narrator voice of the Zhuangzi refers to Kongzi with his rightful authoritative honorific, Kongzi, Master Kong. Robert Zi asks Kongzi, "Why doesn't the world call you Robert Xu instead of calling me Robert Zi?" He also says, "Your Tao is an insane fixation, a mass of deceitful, crafty, vain, hypocritical hooey." Also, like Hannibal Lecter, Robert Zi can face down and outwit his accusers. He turns the tables on Kongzi after the philosopher initiates an exchange with him, seeking to persuade him to reform his ways. By the end of the encounter, it's Kongzi who appears foolish. As he leaves Robert Zi, his eyes are glazed, his complexion like dead ashes, and he's unable to breathe. It's not clear whether Kongzi has grasped Robert Zi's point, but we know at least that he's very unsettled by the encounter. Hans-Georg Müller suggests that the carnivalesque character of Robert Zi highlights how the Confucian plan creates pathological individuals. In their book on the Zhuangzi's philosophy, entitled Genuine Pretending, Hans-Georg Müller and Paul D'Ambrosio describe Robert Zi in this way. The character of Robert Zi is not an outright hero. He's a cannibal with an attitude, a fearless rebel without a cause, close to nature and full of vigor, funny and poetic, ruthless and hedonistic, charming and terrifying, the challenge to establish social hierarchies, and an ironically reversed image of moralist hypocrisies. Müller also believes that in providing an alternative socio-political vision through Robert Zi, this story in the Zhuangzi can have a therapeutic function. But all this doesn't mean that Robert Zi is meant to be an attractive character. At most, and again like Lecter, he's someone you might love to hate. He's the opposite of the Kongzi whom we meet in the Analects, a figure so perfect and exemplary that some readers may have hated how much they were expected to love him. Among those readers were, perhaps, the authors of the Zhuangzi, who offer us a Confucius figure far more interesting and nuanced than in the Analects and other early Confucian texts. Though we've been referring to Confucius as Kongzi in this series, for this episode we'll use Confucius instead. This will help us keep track of the different Chinese names he bears in the Zhuangzi, names that serve as clues to interpretation. We just saw an example. In Confucius's interchange with Robert Zi, the narrative refers to him as Kongzi, yet Robert Zi arrogantly and informally addresses him as Xu. The narrator seems to have put him on a pedestal only so that the fall can be greater. This is, of course, quite a contrast with the Confucian tradition, where Kongzi is always the authoritative teacher. Especially in the Mengzi, Kongzi is held to be the highest sage. In the Zhuangzi, he's more like us, capable of making mistakes, being chastised, having regrets, and sometimes having important insights. Let's begin with Confucius as the spokesperson for the Zhuangzi. In Chapter 4, entitled In the Human World, Yan Hui, Confucius's favorite follower, comes seeking his advice. In this passage, Confucius is referred to as Zhuangzi, a formal address that appropriately reflects the context of his conversation with Yan Hui. It is a form of polite and proper address that occurs frequently when referring to Confucius. Yan Hui tells Confucius that he will undertake a mission to serve the notoriously brutal ruler of Wei, in the hope of positively influencing the ruler and saving his state. This is a noble vision, as the Confucian tradition would see it, a labor of love. Yan Hui says to Zhuangzi, "I wish to take what I have learned from you and to derive some standards and principles from it to apply to this situation. Perhaps then the state can be saved." We'd expect Confucius to pat Yan Hui on the back, congratulating him for his courage. Instead, Confucius tries to talk him out of it, So, Zhuangzi, in this passage, takes the inverse role of the Kongzi portrayed in Conversation with Robert Zi. There, Kongzi is the moralizing proselytizer and is subjected to a critique of his lifelong mission. Here, the same man, now called Zhuangzi, tries to talk Yan Hui out of taking on the Confucian task of converting the wicked to virtue. Confucius then asks Yan Hui how exactly he intends to proceed, and then pours cold water on every strategy that Yan Hui proposes. Instead, he advises him to let his heart-mind engage in fasting instead of fixating on turning the ruler of Wei towards virtue. The fasting of the heart-mind is a process that, metaphorically speaking, purges it of conventional values. If Yan Hui were to fast his heart-mind, he might still proceed with his mission to serve the ruler of Wei, but he wouldn't do it armed with preconceived plans. The idea of fasting the heart-mind in the Zhuangzi stands in direct contrast to the views of Mengzi and Xunzi, who advocated cultivating the heart-mind so that a person properly embraces the Confucian virtues and fluently puts them into practice. In the Zhuangzi, the heart-mind is also a special capacity, but it's not one laden with values and moral commitments. Instead, it is free of any fixed way of seeing the world. This recalls the story of the wheelmaker, who in carving wheels responds with his heart-mind rather than be guided by measuring instruments. Confucius continues to advise Yan Hui, saying that he should cease listening with his ears, but instead listen with his heart-mind, and even with his vital energies. To listen with one's vital energies, qi, is to be open to whatever might come along. To listen with qi is also described as vacuity or emptiness. In its simplest sense, this means that one should approach the world without trying to order it in keeping with our values. In this way, to perceive the world with one's spirit or with qi is a counterpoint to perceiving with our sense organs, as these can be tutored to see the world in certain ways or to hear what we wish to hear. Perceiving the world with the spirit and the vital organs offers non-conventional ways to engage. Of course, it seems odd, if not perverse, to use Confucius to give voice to this idea. In the story, Confucius advises Yan Hui, who has ticked all the boxes in the Confucian system, to abandon his plans to proselytize to the ruler of Wei and instead to become vacuous. But the Zhuangzi doesn't just put its own insights into Confucius's mouth, it sometimes presents him as being downright obtuse. On one occasion, he walks through a forest on his way to Chu. Emerging from the forest, he comes across a cicada catcher, catching cicadas easily with a pole, as though he were grabbing them with his hand. So this is another skill story, like those we considered last time. Indeed, Confucius, first addressed as Zhuangzi in this story, focuses on the issue of skill. He asks the man, "Do you have skill? Is there Tao?" But the cicada catcher ignores Confucius's first question about skill and says simply, "I have Tao." He then describes an elaborate training regime in which he practiced balancing pellets at the end of his pole over many months. There is another complicated set of procedures, positioning his body like a stiff tree trunk and holding his arm like an old dry limb. So, this is yet another passage in which we are invited to consider what it is like to encounter a tree, along with the dream about the sacred tree and the skill story about the bell stand maker Qing, which we've looked at in previous installments. Presumably, the cicada catcher is adapting his body to the environment cicadas would find comfortable so that he doesn't scare them off. Then he attends closely to the cicada wings he needs to snare, not being distracted by anything else in the world. The cicada catcher's attentiveness again reminds us of woodcarver Qing, who forgot everything else that mattered to focus on the nature of the trees. The cicada catcher's mastery is of course a familiar theme, and equally Zhuangzian is the portrayal of Zhuangzi, the respected teacher of the Confucian tradition, seeking to be instructed by a far humbler man. The contrast between their social rank is obvious. Less obvious, but no less important, is the difference in the way the two men speak about cicada catching. The cicada catcher has developed his Tao all by himself, not by looking to role models and descriptions of sage kings, as the Confucians urge us to do. He has observed cicada habits, and adroitly embodies his knowledge of how to catch them. Confucius seems not to have got the message. Instead of addressing the cicada catcher, he turns to his followers, and tries to express the secret of the cicada catcher's success. Confucius tells his followers about the cicada catcher. He keeps his will undivided and concentrates his spirit. Is this not what we say about the venerable hunchback? Here the passage refers to him not as Zhuangzi, but as Kongzi, Master Kong, as he adopts the authoritative voice of a self-appointed teacher, But maybe this teacher is not the best student. Throughout his speech, the cicada catcher has pointedly referred to himself with the self-referential I. It's his learning experience and his mastery of cicada catching. Kongzi is unable not only to catch cicadas, but also to catch the crucial point that this is a mastery one cannot simply encapsulate in a brief formula about will and spirit and transmit to another person. It would be like describing how a skilled detective with years of experience goes about catching serial killers and saying, she looks for clues and then arrests the right man. Then there's one more important detail. The cicada catcher is a hunchback. Surely this makes some difference. His techniques suit him as a hunchback. By contrast, Confucius, if what is widely said of him is true, was a tall man. So he himself might not be able to adopt the posture of the cicada catcher, even if he did the same amount and kind of practice. This passage seems to satirize Confucius's intent to impart instruction, and the satire is all the more biting because he seems quite oblivious to his own shortcomings. Yet in other passages, he at least demonstrates awareness of his own limitations. Having heard of the death of a man named Zisanghu, Kongzi sends his follower, Zigong, to pay his respects. Zigong finds two of Zisanghu's closest friends, but they are not grieving. One of them has composed music, and the other is playing a zither, as the two sing to their dead friend. This is very similar to how Zhuangzi himself takes his wife's death, in a passage we'll discuss next time. Zigong is perplexed by this behavior, and returns to Kongzi, the authoritative master, to ask how this could be. Kongzi explains the situation to Zigong, his regret palpable. These are men who roam outside the lines. I, on the other hand, do my roaming inside the lines. The twain can never meet. It was vulgar of me to send you to mourn for such a person. Confucius continues to explain that the two friends have an enlightened view of death. They have the insight to move beyond boundaries of conventional norms and practices. Partaking in death rituals as required by convention, Confucius admits, serves merely to impress the eyes and ears of the common crowd. When Zigong presses Confucius on where he himself resides within the lines, Confucius says, "Me? I am a casualty of heaven, you and me both." As Confucians, they lead lives guided by active pursuit of specific goals, and this traps them as surely as a cicada ensnared on a pole. In stark contrast are those who live by Tao, who even forget one another, and who plan nothing for others. Though Confucius varies in the extent of his self-awareness, these passages are consistent in associating him with a life hemmed in by norms. Confucius seems helpless and unable to extricate himself so that he can wander beyond the lines. The Zhuangzi even describes him twice as being like a man in chains. One of these two passages, like the story of the cicada catcher, touches on the theme of disability. It occurs in chapter 5 of the Zhuangzi, which is called the Signs of Fullness of Power, and contains a number of stories about people who are disfigured or disabled in some way. Or at least, that's how they would normally be seen, but for the Zhuangzi, they are only thought to be disadvantaged according to some benchmark for what it means to be a normal person. As the title of the chapter suggests, they have a fulfilled life and excel in what they do. In one of these stories, an ex-convict seeks out Confucius for his advice on how to do better with his life. He is called Toeless Shushan because he has had his feet amputated for some unspecified crime. In the story, he walks on his heels to see Confucius, who is at first addressed as Zhuangzi. Confucius spurns him, saying, "You were careless in your past behavior and have thus ended up in this condition. Isn't it a little late to come to me now?" This seems to express contempt of Toeless, as if Confucius were saying to him, "You have committed a crime and have been deservedly punished. I want nothing to do with you." But poor Toeless doesn't take Confucius' remarks lying down. He defends himself, saying that he indeed made an error of judgment in the past, but surely his coming to see Confucius now is indicative of something in him that is more valuable than a foot, which he's lost. Like Robert Si, he then turns the tables on Confucius, saying that he thought that Confucius was comparable to heaven and earth. Whereas Confucius took the moral high ground, condemning Toeless for failing to live up to conventional standards, Toeless now points to a far higher standard, that of heaven and earth. He says, "Heaven covers all things, earth supports all things. I used to think that you, sir, were just like heaven and earth. I never imagined you would instead say something like this." On hearing this, Confucius is immediately contrite, and here, in an irony that is growing familiar, he's no longer called Zhuangzi, but Kongzi. It's precisely as he is humbled that the Zhuangzi uses his honorific as a revered teacher. Confucius admits that he's the one who needs a teacher, saying, "It was rude of me. Won't you please come in and teach me what you've learned?" But Ptolus departs, apparently responding to Confucius's contempt with contempt. As in the story about the cicada catcher, Confucius now turns to his followers and resumes his role as instructor. He notes the man's contrition and commitment to reforming himself, but he just can't help himself from comparing and evaluating people on their moral standing. He tells his followers that they should do even better, as they don't share in the ugliness of Ptolus's past behavior. Having been snubbed, Confucius seems to feel the need to reassert his moral status as Master Kong. The story then continues with Ptolus engaged in conversation with Lao Dan, the alleged author of the Lao Tzu and a revered figure in the Zhuangzi. Lao Dan advises that Ptolus should go easy on Confucius, perhaps giving him a second chance to understand that, by drawing lines between what is acceptable and what not, the Confucius emphasis on its virtues constrains us as much as it guides us. But Ptolus refuses to explain this to Confucius, saying that Kongzi, a polite but less reverential form of address than Kongzi, is in handcuffs and leg chains, a punishment from heaven itself. As this story illustrates, one of the Zhuangzi's many virtues is its contribution to the philosophy of disability. In several other anecdotes from this chapter, disabled people are characterized as monstrous and grotesque. The Zhuangzi deliberately gives them names according to their perceived disabilities. The entire story about Ptolus refers to him simply this way, apart from the first reference to him as Ptolus Shushan. It reflects the disrespect people often have for those such as Ptolus who fail to meet the mark. Alongside Ptolus, there's Hunchback, Limp Peg, the Lipless Cripple, and Jar-Sized Goiter. Albert Galvani has called these figures monsters in keeping with the chapter's portrayal of these people, but the whole point is that they are not in fact monsters. This is just how they are conventionally perceived by others. The Zhuangzi is calling out what we now call an ableist approach to life, which measures people according to an ideal or normal standard of humankind. That approach is hard to shake off. Even when shaken out of his complacency and being forced to defer to Ptolus, Confucius immediately returns to his usual role of calibrating people, telling his followers that they can do better than this Ptolus man. But the Zhuangzi has the last word. It's in fact Confucius who is chained and bound, unable to step outside the lines. As we've already hinted in this chapter, Hannibal Lecter would have something in common with the authors of the Zhuangzi too, namely an abiding interest in death. In a feature of the text sure to get Lecter's mouth watering, death is at the heart of one chapter, which asks whether death will perhaps be followed by a transformation into a mouse's liver. So if you've got the stomach for it, to say nothing of the kidneys and gallbladder, join us for the Zhuangzi on death. Next time here on one of the leading organs of philosophy podcasting, the history of philosophy in China.